Hi again then guys, and welcome to yet another car review from the 1.41 selection of course, and this one is a car which has been talked about a lot, which is funny because for those of us who have played Gran Turismo for some time, even as far back as the original games, this car isn't really all that new in a funny kind of way, because of all of the Porsches that are in GT Sport so far, you could strongly argue that this is one of the most similar to what the roofs used to be like, because although you could kind of say that about the 996 GT3, which is very similar to the Roof RGT, this one somehow feels even more like driving a roof. It's so similar to the BTR, the CTR, of course the Yellowbird in general, and it's just that iconic, classic Porsche 911 from the early 80s. You don't have all-wheel drive to help you, barely any downforce from that picnic table rear wing, and a turbo, as if it wasn't already lairy enough, because of course we need to make it faster. But, you know, great on them for doing that, because what an icon the car is. Now, in the 80s, a lot of cars were not necessarily easy to drive, and I would certainly put this car in a similar category to stuff like the even earlier examples of stuff like the Shelby Cobra, later examples of stuff like modern-day TVRs, and even TVRs in the 90s like the Chimera, the Cerbera, the birth of the Tuscan, etc., and a number of others too, even including the Lambo Diablo, which incidentally just so happens to be one of the most dangerous supercars ever made, so it's not like having a challenging car makes it automatically bad, and that is unfortunately what some people seem to be considering this to be. They just find it maybe too slippery, too leery, not really worth the effort, not really worth the time. Well, if that is your opinion, I would urge you to at least try and reconsider it. Now, I'm not going to try and tell you that this thing is the best thing in the game. Even for a particular class, for instance, like N300, there are certainly easier and potentially also faster options out there, even within Porsche, ironically, because you can detune the 996 GT3 from the earlier 2000s down to the same class. You can get that car in N300 anyway. So do you have to use this? No, absolutely not. This is just that level of classic authenticity and a challenge for the type of driver who wants that. It's not the kind of car that does all the work for you, it's much more of a challenge, but a very rewarding one, because just like Cobras, Diablos, TVRs, the one thing that all of those have in common is they're not just difficult to drive, because a car being difficult to drive doesn't automatically make it good. It's the fact that they're difficult, but also very rewarding when you do drive them well. And that is the case with this Porsche also, because it is a six-figure vehicle, it's 100,000 credits, but pump the brakes on the Blue Moon Bay money-earning hopes, because unfortunately you cannot use this car in that event so far. I'm hoping that they change that, like they did with the new Supra, which of course you can now use. However, I will say my hopes of this car in that event aren't necessarily all that high, even if you could use it, because the 996 GT3 is already eligible, but just doesn't really feel quick enough, so it would kind of surprise me if this one did, but who knows, it certainly has the potential, but we'll have to wait and see. In general though, what does it offer? Well, completely stock, which you can actually experience if you're watching this video close to the release. You'll be able to go online into sport mode, and as far as I know, you don't need PlayStation Plus to actually enter the new time trial events. Now, one of those events, which I've personally competed in as well, is using this car completely stock on comfort tyres on the Nordschleife. And it's certainly a challenge compared to a lot of other cars that you'll experience in the game. The front end is very flighty because all the weight is over the back with the rear engine, rear drive layout, but at the same time, it kind of switches between this very loose feeling that the car sometimes has in a straight line, in particular over that front end, but then midway through a corner, and especially on the exit of a corner, you'll often find that it just kicks that tail out a little bit and tries to drift. You need to be careful at that point the most, and this goes for driving Porsches in general, but especially an older one, and that is be very careful on how you correct that. Even more so, I would argue, than in a normal car, because in most cars, you know, like some front engine rear wheel drive sports car for instance, you can correct it reasonably easily. An all-wheel drive car even more so. With a rear engine rear wheel drive car from the 80s like this one, you need to be very careful, because you've got such a bias really toward that back end that even trying to correct it, you can end up completely sliding out the other way instead, overcorrecting it in effect and snatching the steering too much. So that's one of the main things that you need to be careful of. Of course, its age will show in certain ways. Soggier suspension, weaker brakes, all that kind of stuff definitely comes through. But at the same time, you shouldn't really complain about those things because it should feel like that. That is authentic. You don't want a 1981 Porsche to feel just as good as a 2010 Porsche, because that would be ridiculous. That would be just an arcade game at that point. And of course, there are certain cars that I would love to be more competitive than they are, but this isn't necessarily one of them. It should feel as it does, it should be more challenging, and it should be that little bit slower. Especially, I would argue, when it comes to something like a Porsche 911, because, and I believe I might have mentioned this before, I've always considered the Porsche 911 as a lineage, not just this one, but all of them, to this day in fact. And as a caveat to that, I'll say probably now more than ever, in fact, to be very similar to the Nissan GTR lineage. And that is, they are these two vehicles which have had a long and rich history on the road and on the track in various forms of motorsport, where they've sometimes lost, they've sometimes won, but generally the track record is very, very strong. And one of the key reasons, if not the key reason, why that has always remained the same is because neither the Porsche 911 or the Nissan GTR lineage, including the Skyline, of course, have ever rested on their laurels. They have never done that. The new generation, with each facelift and each new model, be it a turbo or a GT3 or a GT2, even up to the bonkers GT1, the point has always been to refine and improve the car with every new generation. And look what that can do when you take that to the nth degree. Look how overwhelmingly fast the GTR R35 was back in 2007 when it burst onto the scene. It was pretty much untouchable for the money. Likewise with the Porsche 911, for me, when I really noticed the jump in modern performance was with the 997 Turbo. It just blew everything away at around a similar time to the Nissan, and they've always had this very similar commonality between the two, where they've done just that. They've consistently made the cars better and better with each new generation, never looking back too much. You know, they take from their history and they pay homage to it. Certainly the 911 does. It's kind of a running joke that it looks the same. It doesn't, of course, but you get what people mean. But at the same time, it never tries to make those cars feel like they did back then. It's always the new thing, updating the tech, making it faster, making it better. And if you drive each of the 911s from this to the 996 to the 997 and then to the newest one, the 991, which we had of course in the game first, you can feel the improvements. It's amazing. You can feel the distinct similarities and differences between those cars. So is this challenging? Absolutely. Should it be? Absolutely, because that is the kind of car it is. It's a Porsche, it's a classic, it should feel every bit as challenging as it is. But at the same time, with tuning, with the right driving technique and the right style, and just with pure practice, which is often overlooked, let's be honest, by many people, you get to use this car enough and you will be good with it. Because although it's not necessarily going to beat everything out there, it's got a ton of potential. And again, just like the Skylines, just like the GTRs, it doesn't matter how old they are, they can still compete with at least some of the modern stuff. But overall, that's it for my thoughts on the 930 911 Turbo. I think it's a very authentic car, and although kind of contrary to what it may sound, it's actually not one of my favourite Porsches, but I do like how they've represented it in the game, so I'd love to hear, of course, your thoughts down below. I will be tuning the car as well on the channel, probably for N300, and I will say that I think the only downside for me about the car is unfortunately you cannot detune this to N200. It's literally right there next to it and you just can't do it. That's a shame. It feels like a little bit of a cop-out, but at the same time, at least you can use the Porsche 356 in N200 already, so it's not too bad if you do want to represent Porsche. But overall, that's it for my thoughts. As I said, of course, I will see you guys next time, and for now, as always, thanks for watching.